Well, greetings. Today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to take some time for us to take a look at a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's really one of the core things that I do with my work as a fractional COO, and that pertains to documentation of processes, policies, and procedures. Um, the terminology I would use to kind of categorize all of these three into one area is institutional memory. And what we're going to talk about today, as I share my PowerPoint presentation, is we're going to address the issue of poor institutional memory and how this is a hidden deal killer. Now, again, keep in mind that up to 30% of business sales are successful. I've seen it between 20 to 30%. And, really a lot of it depends on, not only industry, but also size of business. But the key is at the end of the day, overwhelming majority of businesses do not successfully sell. Now, what we're going to be talking about in this is if we do all of what we're discussing in this webinar correctly, you could see a substantial hike of your valuation just because you have everything fully documented and it's clear who owns what. So with that having been said, let's dive in here really quickly and let's take a look at the $2.3 million question. Now, this is a specific situation now, and other situations, this could be much higher, it could be lower. But during the process of due diligence, about 3 months in, the potential buyer is asking, okay, could you just walk me through customer order fulfillment? Well, the owner couldn't. He couldn't really describe it, but he said that he understood it exactly. He had everything laid out in his head as how the order fulfillment was supposed to occur. The result, that buyer immediately said, okay, well, this is too heavily dependent on the owner. So I figure it's going to take me X amount in order to get it. So that's why we come to that $2.3 million question, is because that wound up being what the deduction was, just because the reality is the buyer realizes, okay, if I'm going to get this business, then I'm going to need to come in and fix this problem. So the reality is, in this case, it's something simple. Literally, if he would actually sit down for a day, write out everything, and maybe even discover, okay, I could adjust this and do that, this would be avoided. And the reality is, with a lot of businesses, policies, processes, and procedures, even though we figure things out and do them in our head, just simply writing them down would increase the value. You figured it out. You've done the hard part. It's just a matter of writing it down. So that brings us then to the buyers versus owners. And I'm not exactly 100% sure why some things happened the way they did on the sale. But what this is, these flow charts, while, obviously there's some issues, I think it was just because of, with how some of the slides were formatted. What I'm trying to illustrate, especially when it comes to this company chart and also this workflow, is this. Buyers want the pictures that you are seeing. They want everything clearly mapped out. They want everything thoroughly illustrated. They want everything to know exactly who owns what, who does what happens when, where, how, and why. They're not actually interested in, just, buying a business that, has a really nice, fancy, schmancy idea. They want things concrete. So that way, if something were to happen, we knew, okay, so-and-so needs to jump in and do this, or, okay, we need somebody to cover that role. So here are our objectives for this session. We're going to take a look at why documentation has such a huge role in determining business valuation, why it is so important that you take the time to write everything down. We're also going to, kind of take the 90-day test, which, a lot of buyers are going to apply. And it's one thing that I like to ask people right at the beginning of my engagement with them as a fractional COO. And, we're going to look at practical documentation frameworks as well as how to make sure that we're converting documentation into valuation premium. So let's start with this 90-day test. And this is a test that a lot of buyers are going to ask. If you and the top 2 employees were to disappear tomorrow, could the business operate 90 days without revenue loss? So that's a tough question. And the reality is, okay, if it's the business owner disappearing, that's one thing. But if it's the 2 top employees, well, how does that work? Well, this is again why documentation is so valuable. Because if you thoroughly write out everything so that you can look at and go, okay, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. If you do all of that and are absolutely thorough with it, if people are gone, it's like, okay, we know this needs to be done. Can we temporarily assign this task to somebody? Or can you do this? So in short, it should make sense why having things written down is so important. And again, here's some of the questions that the buyers are going to be asking as well. How do you fulfill orders? Who's going to handle customer service? Who's going to make operational decisions? Who's going to onboard new customers? Who's going to resolve vendor issues? In short, if you do a thorough job with your institutional memory, you're going to have everything written down. And also, you're probably going to have set like, okay, in the event that somebody is not here, such and such should be covering it. So the litmus test then for you with this 90-day test is, could a competent manager step in Monday and then basically manage the business until not only Friday, but how long would they be able to manage this business with just the documentation you have provided? That is what you need to answer. So now that we've gotten to this, let's take a look at documentation deal killers. There are 4 of them that we're going to really kind of dive into here. First, it's the founder bottleneck, where every decision has to come to you. That's, could be between a 20 to 35% valuation reduction. Tribal knowledge problem, where it's like, okay, basically everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but it resides in their head. It hasn't been written down. That's going to extend due diligence and is going to reduce a lot of confidence. Compliance time bomb. It's like, okay, well, what are you supposed to do? Like, is there stuff that you need to have filed by such and such a date? Do you have this stuff documented as far as like, key deadlines? That's going to be a termination risk likely if you can't have that. And then scalability ceiling is, if it's clear that you haven't thoroughly documented, so that way there's an easy plan to grow over time, you're going to have substantially limited growth potential, and that's going to be impacted in the valuation. I mean, business owner, when a prospective business owner wants to buy a business that is well built and has the potential to grow, if there are built-in limitations like this, that's going to drastically impact your value. So, having said that, let's take a look at the real numbers. Well-documented businesses, 1.5 to 2 times higher multiples, just by documentation. And the beauty of that is, in addition to that documentation, it's also going to mean that there's a good chance that owner dependency is not going to be great. Yeah, there may still need to be decisions that are so critical you need to make, but if you have everything written down so somebody else can own it, the business is just not going to be as dependent on you. 73% of deals are failed because of operational concerns. So think about that. Almost 3 out of every 4 deals that fail, it's because of operational issues. What does this stem from? Well, the operations could be optimized, but I could almost be willing to bet it's because things aren't documented enough thoroughly. Average valuation deduction I have here at 1.8 million, and that's on an 8 million sale. You do the math, there's a possibility that it could get a lot higher for a lot larger business. Now, the time to close, if you're going to have issues with your documentation, it could really stretch it out to a year or more if it even happens. Whereas if you have everything thoroughly documented, you could breeze through in 4 to 6 months. So now that we've taken a look at these real numbers, let's lay out the exit ready framework. Here you have in this visual, you have this pyramid. We start out with the that which is mission critical, which are core processes that directly impact business value. That these are the reason that there's a reason it's at the top is because this is just super important. Then the operational foundation are the policies and procedures that are ensuring we have consistency. But then at the base, we have the strategic concept, which are decision frameworks that provide clarity and direction. There's a reason that that's at the base, and that's really is just because of the fact that we need to have clarity and direction, so that way we can have a good operational foundation. And once we have that, then the mission critical core processes that directly impact business value, they'll really be able to take off. But if we don't have a good foundation, it's just not going to work. Now, let's apply the Goldilocks principle here. Too little when it comes to this framework, deal failure. Too much, people are going to look and say, whoa, we have this massive bureaucracy here. That's going to cause another problem. We need to hit it just right, where we have core workflows, but we also have built-in flexibility. So in other words, you want to build something that is solid, but at the same time, if you need to adjust, you can have built-in flexibility as well. So now, let's take a look at mission-critical documentation. Well, what is this? Well, let's take a look at Tier 1, the mission-critical documentation, which you really need to document first. All of your core processes, which include sales, fulfillment, onboarding, quality control, and financial closing. And for each, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to have a process map, as well as, figure out who is the owner of it, have inputs and outputs, systems, success criteria, and exceptions. And then, obviously you're going to need to have standard operating procedures. You're going to need to have everything figured out step by step with screenshots, time estimates, skills required. You need to just whatever you need in order to get it done. And that's really what it comes down to is, you have a diagram up here about customer onboarding. But what's important is when I'm talking about everything from core processes and SOPs, as well as any needed policies, is you put in absolutely everything that is needed in order to make sure the job gets done right, it gets done properly, efficiently, and on time. That is what the most important thing. And really, I'm just throwing out a lot of things that you could put in, but don't think you have to put it in. Put in what you need. Okay, so really what we need to do now is, now that we've kind of taken a look at this, is let's take a look at operational foundations. And this is kind of like Tier 2, and it's building a strong foundation. Well, here, this is where you need to make sure all of your policies are in place. Your HR is all taken care of. Your financials are in order. You have everything with customers as well as data security, your CRMs, and then, job descriptions. In other words, this is where you should probably work with everybody to, lay out a job description of what they do. And, this could be a good exercise because you may actually be surprised by what a person does and what they don't do. They may actually be doing more than you think they are. And they may actually be doing not only more than they think they are, but they may actually not be doing everything that you think they are doing. Yeah, if that makes sense. So getting those descriptions in, training, this is where we need to figure out, okay, because obviously with a business, there are going to be new employees coming in. How do we get onboarding, role curriculum, knowledge bases? Got to get all that figured out. And then, obviously, figuring out any like ways to reduce any founder bottlenecks or rapid hiring. We want to eliminate that. We want to figure out how to systematize it. So those are issues we want to address here at the operational foundation. So now that we've done that, let's get to the strategic context. This is this is really where, even though it's at the bottom of that pyramid, this is really foundational. And at the end of the day, while obviously we have to get the mission critical and the operational foundational done, this is where, if we want the mission critical and the operational foundational work to really take off, we need to make sure this is done really well, because this is going to be the bedrock that's going to really ensure the others are able to really be built, we'll be able to build very high up on it. We need to have decision frameworks, pricing, vendor selection, investments, procurement strategies, obviously, developing, okay, what's a list of items for, capital investment. When I was president of an organization, I always like to ask, okay, what is a list of things that we could buy that would actually be able to help improve our product? And, and it got to the point eventually where actually we were fine. We didn't need anything at the moment just because we were at capacity, and that resulted in other things. But the point I'm trying to make is this: figuring out what we need when it comes to pricing, processes for vendors, but also when it comes to figuring out what equipment we need to buy. That type of framework is going to be invaluable for scaling everything, as you can see. Another aspect is in historical context. One of the reasons why I like to ask clients for every piece of information when I start work with them is I want to know everything, as much that has happened as possible. So that way I will not only know if something has been attempted before, but I may get an idea about why it didn't work when it was attempted before. And then, of course, obviously, if we have intellectual property, we need that documented. Methodologies, trade secrets, brand guidelines, that's crucial, just because of the fact that, we're going to be using that. And, if we get that all taken care of, we'll be able to, and systematize, we'll be able to really scale with it. So those are the most important things with that pyramid. Now let's move on to the topic of implementation. Now, one thing I should mention is this webinar is not being presented in terms of how I would necessarily do this. Since this is one of the 7 pillars that I work with, there's a very good chance that my implementation would look a little different, just because I'm trying to juxtapose other things. But this is really to give you an idea as far as how things should look if you were to do it on your own. And by the way, even though there's a lot of aspect of exit planning that you should bring somebody in to help you with, this is not one of them. This is something that you really should be doing. And the reason why I have it set up is so that way, if it hasn't been done, we can get it done. So here's the 90-day documentation sprint that I would encourage any business owners who've never done this to do it. Month 1, foundation. You're going to create your process inventory of all the processes in your business. You're going to then prioritize by revenue and customer impact. And then what I want you to do is I want you to really thoroughly document the top 5 mission critical processes. Then the next month, what you're going to do is you're going to complete everything as far as the processes are concerned. Then you're going to start working on job descriptions. Again, this is something that you don't necessarily have to do. You can just say, hey, I want everybody this week to, maybe take a half hour or an hour on the clock, just write out a detailed job description. And you could even, maybe have a survey. You could just ask questions. I have a survey that I use for this process, but really what the whole purpose is you're just trying to get everything down and documented. So that way, This particular role does this. Then the final thing you're going to do is develop training outlines. The reality is, especially if you have a lot of stuff email or digitally, you as well as probably everybody else in the business probably have a lot of this documentation already somewhere, so you can actually do it. You don't necessarily need to feel like I have to reinvent the wheel. You probably have a lot of it done. And, you can talk with your team and think, okay, let's kind of get these outlines together. And then the third month, you're going to do refinement. What you're going to do is you're going to test a lot of this with new and junior employees. You're going to try to gather feedback and start identifying any gaps. And then you're going to move on to the policies that we talked about in tier 1 back earlier. You're going to start getting all your policies written down. And one note I should mention is when it comes to policies, don't have any exceptions. If you carve exceptions out of policies, they become worthless. Write a policy that has absolutely no exceptions written into it. If you do that, you're going to have a really good policy that's going to be very useful. Now, time investment, it could initially be 10 to 15 hours a month, maybe on your end. But, obviously, if you're able to get as many people involved as possible, you can spread it around. And, if it's a total of 15 hours involving all 50 employees in your business, the reality is that's not going to take a lot of time. It might be a half hour, even 20 minutes a person. So, try to be efficient. And, once you get all of this done, it may take some monthly maintenance, which if you take what we're talking about to its logical conclusion, you can spread that out among department heads and other members of your leadership team. Okay, now let's get into the documentation ownership model. Very important part. What you need to do is you don't make it the owner's sole responsibility when it comes to this. I've already alluded to this. What you need to do is you need to distribute the documentation based on who really needs to own it. Obviously, the owner or the executive, they're going to need to set standards and quarterly reviews. Department heads, they need to own their own functional areas. If you have a C-suite official over several department heads, then there may actually be some things that they need to focus on that, would kind of fall in the gaps. But the key is everybody has got to own something. You can't have anything that's owned by 2 or 3 people, just because it's like the adage goes, if 2 people are responsible for feeding a horse, the horse starves. Well, here, one owner, and make sure that they own it and it is their responsibility. And then obviously, the process owners, they need to be the ones who are creating and monitoring and evaluating the SOPs. But then the team members who they may not actually have official leadership roles, they need to be given feedback, because if they're the one, essentially the equivalent of boots on the ground, I repeat, you need to be getting input from them, hearing what they have to say or think on the topic. And, hey, if when it comes to accountability, tie this to performance reviews. Have them assess what they've been doing, and, just make sure that, it's not only owned, but at the same time that, they're consistently trying to get better. Okay, now, your documentation for your tech stack. This is something that, is going to look a little different for each company, just because the tech stack is going to be different. And, for example, you could have a very simple starter kit, Notion or Google Drive free using their package. Loom is free. Lucidchart has a free tier. Google Sheets are freer. And you can, kind of upgrade these as needed. But the reality is what you're going to need to do is, when it comes to documenting your tech stack, you're going to need to have everything, like from, when it comes to data entry to, how records are supposed to be formatted. I mean, and even then, some of the documentation here is going to probably involve SOPs. But what you want to think about when it comes to documentation here is you need to think anything and everything that is needed in order to make sure that that tech stack functions at with peak efficiency. It could be simple. It could be complex. Really, this is where the more in-depth and intimately where you or whoever is over the tech stack is aware of, how things work, the better you will be. So now let's take a look at how all this documentation has an impact with valuation. Documentation as a valuation driver is a real thing. Now, scenario A, same revenue, 10 million, EBITDA, 2 million. Because of the founder dependency, the result was it got a valuation of 6 million. The founder dependency really hurt. Scenario B, same thing, but because the documentation was there, and as a result, it was viewed as being highly transferable, and there was reduced risk, that actually bumped the valuation up to 10 million. So while this is a hypothetical, the illustration here is you could have the exact same value, but if you don't have your documentation thorough, that's going to be viewed as a risk, and a risk that a lot of people are not going to want to assume. So here, and I just really want, if I could just hone in on something and say, this is what you need to be thinking about. These are the 4 things that buyers assess when it comes to documentation. Is it consistent? Are you actually following the processes? And this is why I have an annual review document that I want that I give to every leadership team. I mean, this annual review document is like, okay, once you've been assembled, now you need to be very clearly following everything that's on here. You can adjust it as needed, but you need to review everything annually to make sure practice is matching what is written down. That is a non-negotiable. Currency has it been updated within 12 months? Again, that's why you have the annual review process. Annually, during the course of the year, you're doing different things. You're reviewing, you're addressing, you're tweaking. In other words, there's a very good chance that as the year is going on, you may be looking at these documents multiple times just to assess, is it current? Can we do it better? Completeness. Is everything covered or only 80%? The more thorough and more complete you are, the better the transferable value you're going to get. And then usability. Is it possible that someone can actually use them and to do the work? That's an important thing that needs to be taken into consideration. So here, when we get to this, due diligence speed equals buyer confidence. If it's taking a long time to close, it means the buyer is not very confident. If things are moving along like clockwork, it means the buyer is not seeing any red flags. So the benefit of it being faster is it means less deal fatigue, and there's a very good likelihood there are going to be fewer retrades, which basically is the buyer coming back and saying, hey, I know we agreed to this price, but because of what we discovered here, can we renegotiate it at this level? Because we're going to need to come in and fix this. So that's really an important thing. With due diligence, speed is going to tell you a lot about how successful the deal is. So let's take a look at some common mistakes when it comes to documentation. Documentation theater. You create a doc that nobody uses. Well, you can fix this by testing it with real users. If you have something that's written down that nobody ever uses, that's a problem. That's not good documentation. That sounds to me like an orphan where there's nobody who's actually in charge of it. Another thing, perfection paralysis. You're waiting to get everything just right. I remember working with a nonprofit once that their emphasis was like, let's get it right. Let's get it right. The problem was it never got done. I actually resigned from that organization because I realized, hey, I kept insisting on getting it right, getting it right, getting it right, and it never got done. And it was clear that, for everything that we had and the momentum that we could have, we were just not going anywhere. A one-time event, pre-sale project only. What's the point of that? I mean, if you have it for just one time, I mean, yes, you could have it and then maybe archive and say, okay, this was for this particular situation. But, you know, the odds are if it's a one time event, there's a very good chance that there are actually a lot of other one time events that you're having. And most likely, if you were to create something that could actually address all of them, that's much more effective. Over documentation. You have 50 pages describing just how to set up the first slide of a PowerPoint presentation. That's not needed. There's a reason we have the acronym Keep It Simple, Stupid. In other words, obviously get it thoroughly documented, but only put down what you actually need to have. If you really, really, really want to have write that doctoral dissertation that you feel like you never had the opportunity to write, well, do it with something else. And for the record, even when I did my doctoral dissertation, anytime there was stuff that was superfluous or not needed, we cut it. And then, owner as the sole documenter, that's going to burn you out. Don't do that. So now that we've looked at the common documentation mistakes, let's take a look at the timeline and really your readiness assessment. I want you to ask these 7 questions to yourself. And, if you feel free to re-listen to this segment as many times as possible to get them. Could a new operations manager run the business using only the documents? Are your top 10 revenue processes documented? Have your SOPs been updated within 12 months? Are there written policies for all major decisions? Can you onboard new employees with materials alone? Can decision frameworks be documented? Would it pass buyer due diligence? Those are questions that, really, even though you could rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, I think you could probably say that there's always room for improvement. So a 10 is never really going to be attainable. If you had all 10s, there's a good chance you probably have several that are much lower. So be very critical and, really try to ask yourself these questions from the standpoint of, I really, really, really need to make sure that everything is clicking just right. So here is the 3-year exit documentation timeline that we really need to look at. During the first year, you really need to make sure that you have all of the tier 1 documentation we talked about earlier documented. You have all standards in place and you go on an ownership model. In other words, once it's documented, so-and-so is in charge of it. During year 2, that's when you're expanding and testing. You're kind of trying to, complete tier 1, tier 2. You're testing things, not only new hires, but also refining. And during the final year, really before you sell, that's when you're getting everything organized and cleaned up and you're completing your tier 3. And you might even want to do a mock-up of it. And then obviously, once you've got that done, you need to keep everything current. Really, it needs to be a living system. It's going to grow. It's going to need to be pruned. It's going to need to be it needs to be addressed consistently. And what you need to do is, I would encourage you, like what I have set up for my project management system when it comes to developing things like this, which I call FCPMS, is you need to show cumulative documentation percentage building. In other words, how close are we to this? So that way we can see, okay, yeah, we're making progress, or no, we got a long ways to go. So, having said that, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to consider the possibility of going deeper with a readiness review. Just consider calling me up and talk. We can assess where things are. I have no problem just saying, okay, yeah, this sounds great, or no, this isn't where it needs to be. But what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate current gaps, identify priority processes, create a customized roadmap, and then assess your team capacity as well as identify potential killers. Now, ideally, this is for business owners at any stage. I'm going to say this is not really for business owners 3 to 5 years from exiting. This is more like 5 to 7 years at a minimum. If you're starting your business, you should be considering a lot of these things. Now, the one thing to remember that is really important is when it comes to transforming your business value is your business is worth the predictability, transferability, and scalability that documentation creates. The question isn't whether you have the time, it's whether you can afford not to do so. That is a very, very important thing to keep in mind. It's not a matter of do you have the time to do it, it's a matter of can you afford not to do it. So what I want to do is I just want to hit a couple of quick questions that you might be having here. What's the time required for this? Well, a lot of the work that we've discussed, especially if you distribute it among your team, really it's only going to be a few hours a month for you and at most for your team. And it may be more like an hour or two for each team member. This is not going to really cut into your productivity. Is it going to slow business? Well, maybe a little initially, but the reality is if everything is documented, you're going to be able to onboard and accomplish things much faster, possibly as much as 60% faster. What about when it comes to hiring somebody? Well, yes, initially, but the reality is eventually this is going to be the type of thing that, you may need to hire somebody, especially if you discover you need to reorganize things structurally. Do you keep current? Yes, as current as possible. With the annual review process I mentioned, it's occurring over the course of the year. So there's a good chance that you may be needing to revisit things regularly. Or you may be able to say, yeah, we're reviewing it. It's still good. Now, if you're only 12 months out from an exit and you are reading this and seeing you don't have all this in place, you're not 12 months out from an exit, unless you want to take a huge discount from a private equity firm. So there you have it, the importance of having good institutional memory and how poor institutional memory can be a deal killer. You have right there on the final slide my contact information. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what happened with the formatting with the phone number, but apparently, but the number, it's 864-735-7613. I would love to talk with you if you have watched this presentation and feel like, this is relevant to you. Obviously, this is something that these topics, it's a matter of we can always do better. And my goal at the end of the day is to be able to help make sure that you do things better. So I would love to hear from you. And I want to thank everybody for their time and watching this. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day.